Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line. Two major advances, one by the Russians and one by the Ukrainians. The Russians managed to capture over 20 square kilometers in a single push in the eastern parts of the Dnipropet region through the second line of defense in the Zaporizhia direction. The Ukrainians managed to recapture about 10 square kilometers, mostly from the gray zone to the northeast of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians also managed to recapture some positions in the west of Tretk, where the Russians are outflanking them in the northeastern direction. The Russians also managed to advance in the north of Leman. Starting out with the major advance by the Russians within the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians made a combined push and used multiple weaponries to gain control over a vast area, including the settlement of Ternove. The Russians, with the capture of Novomykolaivka to the south and Sosnivka to the north, had a road directly connecting the northern and southern directions. Therefore, the Russians launched an artillery campaign on the settlements of Beresove, Ternove, and the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here in between Sosnivka and Novomykolaivka. Then launched an assault with armored vehicles through these roads to connect in the center to gain control over some of these fortified positions and establish themselves north of Beresove. This encircled the Ukrainian forces within Ternove, and with the cover of FPV drones flying overhead in Ternove, dropping munitions on Ukrainian forces encircled within the settlement, and providing information for the Russian forces storming the settlement from the east, south, and north, allowed the Russians to quickly gain control over the settlement, wipe out the Ukrainian entrenchment within the settlement, and now push to the outskirts of Beresove, where the Russians are storming the settlement from the east and from the north. The Russian operation here took several days to complete, but it was completed today. Therefore, multiple sources each provided a piece to these developments. Deep State Map provided information about the Russian push from the south towards the west of Ternove. Zodiac maps the push from the north in the direction of Sosnivka down towards the fortified positions. And geolocated footage confirms the Russian capture of Ternove and the process to which they got control of it. With this, the Russians have successfully gained control over several fortified positions along the second defensive line and one of the main strongholds of the Ukrainians alongside this bulge in the second defensive line. The Russians are slowly pushing through to gain full control of it. The main push is going to be taking place from the second line of defense, the trench system itself, to the north of Beresove and Stepove, and from the southern flank of the anti-tank ditches and Dragon Teeth in the direction of Kalinivske here to the south. We are now in the fall season. This means that the muddy weather will return, and therefore the roads are much more important than they have been over the past 3 months. The Russians are therefore mainly advancing through these roads to keep a stable supply line for their forces going forward. The main push is coming through the second line of defense, but there's also a lot of fighting taking place in the first line of defense. Simply no advances taking place as the Russians are focusing on the bulge, which allows the second and first line of defense to converge here at this point. If the Russians are able to gain full control over this bulge, then the advances through the first line of defense will continue along the main road in the rear of the fortified positions. The Russians also managed to make a small advance to the north of Sosnivka as they are fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here to the south of the Vovcharevo line, which is the final fortified position ahead of Orostopil and Veliko Mikhailivka. What we're seeing is that following this second line of defense, there's really not a lot of fortifications the Ukrainians have prepared. Some are being built and therefore haven't been mapped yet, and the Ukrainians are constantly building new fortifications, but these new fortifications are hastily made and not up to par with the first and second lines of defense, which have received a lot of funding and time spent to protect the Zaporizhia region and the entrance into the Dnipropetrovsk region. However, the Russians are slowly breaking through these fortifications, attacking them from their weak points, gain control over them, opening up the road for the next phase in the Russian offensive operations, which will take place during this fall and winter periods, which is the Russian attempts to gain control over the Zaporizhia region as they continued offensive operations within the Donetsk region. The Ukrainians continued their counterattack to the north of the settlement of Tretk, regaining control over additional fortified positions and fields here to the east of Dnipropet. The Ukrainians are regaining control over the anti-tank ditch line and Dragon Teeth line here to the southeast of Dnipropet, east of Sqkm, to push the Russians back across. The Russians had limited capacity to resupply their forces and have limited supply in this area, which allowed them to get a lot of success and regain a lot of territory in a short amount of time. However, the Ukrainians are still attempting to gain a foothold within Novotretsk following days of fighting in that area. What we're seeing is that the Russians are creating some kill zones here in these areas, where in coordination with short-range reconnaissance drones, FPV drones, and so on, are providing information for long-range strikes by artillery systems, allowing them to heavily strike any position the Ukrainians are establishing within the settlements of Pankivka and Novotretsk. The Ukrainians have, following many weeks of fighting, been unable to establish themselves within these settlements and are working instead on the flanks, where the Russians have less coverage and less information to prevent these counterattacks. The Ukrainians have then been able to reestablish control over the defensive line itself. The Russians will likely be pushed beyond the final positions, and then fighting will continue in the direction of Novotretsk, where the Ukrainians will look to cut off the supply lines of the Russian forces to the northwestern positions. Even gaining control over Novotretsk will significantly limit the supplies and the resupply capability of the Russians here across the river line. Therefore, fighting continues in the direction of Novognemishne. If the Russians are able to regain control over the fortified positions near the settlement and solidify their control within the settlement itself, they'll have a solid supply line to their forces and will be able to redirect their positions to the north and counterattack in the direction of Dnipropet, getting control over which will create a solid defensive position along the river lines to protect the northern flank as they continue fighting over the southern flank and push in the direction of the western flank. Therefore, a lot of fighting is taking place over the northeastern direction, where the Ukrainians are attempting a large victory by cutting off the river line, and the Russians are working mainly on defense to solidify their positions and hold back any Ukrainian breakthrough of their lines. In the direction of Tretk, the Ukrainians managed to regain full control over Leman and re-enter Katerinivka here on the northwestern flank. This is to regain control over the high ground and the fortified positions overlooking Novospassky, which will solidify their defensive positions in this area, while the Russians are outflanking them, pushing in the direction of Pleshivka, gaining a foothold on the eastern outskirts of the settlement. The Russians are here looking to cut off the supply line to the Ukrainian forces, which will still be able to be resupplied through drones, but will not have enough firepower to deal with the Russian forces constantly shelling their positions and launching any assaults on their positions, and will eventually lose their positions if their supply lines are cut, with the road along the dam and the northeastern flank of Leman is cut off. The Russians are mainly pushing through the railway area and are looking to gain control over the fortified positions, gain control over Dnipropet and Pleshivka to cut off the supply route from the north. Further to the north, the Russians continue their offensive operations in the direction of Leman, where they are gaining some incremental gains here to the north of Sqkm, pushing through the forest patch areas and the forest lines. They're looking here to gain full control over the road leading into Sqkm and the settlement itself, to connect their forces between Sqkm and Sarishne in the east, as well as launch offensive operations to the rear of Dobryshev from the east. The Russians have also managed to send reinforcements in the direction of Shandriholove, where the 1st Tank Army has started operating in this area to gain control over the supply lines in the northwest of Leman and start offensive operations towards Leman itself to gain full control over the city. While all of these developments are taking place in the front line in Ukraine, the Zapad 2025 exercises have begun in Belarus as well as northwestern Russia. What we're seeing is that the Russians are doing the Zapad 2025 exercises, but not just those exercises themselves, but additional exercises to the southeast of Russia as well, in the eastern parts of the border between Russia and Ukraine. The Russians are doing a massive combination of different military exercises. Some are public, some are not public, mainly centered around the Ukraine and NATO area in Western Russia. The Russian National Guard has shown some footage from some of their exercises where they are working mainly on anti-drone warfare, special forces with infantry infiltrating behind Ukrainian lines, and artillery and long-range tank usage, working on counter-armored vehicle warfare from a long distance. At the same time, the combined training with Russia and Belarus are mainly centered around the northwest of Belarus and western Belarus, with the borders to the Baltics and Poland. This is to avoid any relation to Ukraine itself, avoid any escalation along the border between Belarus and Ukraine, as well as the main forces inside Russia for the Zapad 2025 exercises are in the Leningrad military district near St. Petersburg, along the eastern flank of the Baltics and Finland, as well as in the Moscow area. This is again somewhat far from the border to Ukraine. The eastern exercises also in the Kazan and the Ryazan directions, where the Russians are far enough from the border to avoid Ukrainian long-range strikes. So what we're seeing is that the Russians are showing off the capabilities that they have learned through this conflict and are training new soldiers in the usage of these new tactics and new equipment. What we're likely going to be seeing is that these forces will then be redirected to Ukraine following these exercises, as the Russians will continue to build up their combat capabilities. A large influx of forces, whether it is 50,000 or 100,000, can have a significant impact on the war in Ukraine if they enter at the same time, whether opening a new front or strengthening existing ones. Therefore, it is important to keep an eye out for the equipment used in these exercises, as well as the personnel, where they'll be moved and where they'll be entering from if they enter the war, or if there will be forces in reserve for rotations or other unpredictable developments. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.